a private corporation. Neither you and I, the people, nor the federal government for that matter, own these corporations, these so-called banks. They are owned by other corporations, known as member banks.
The Fed was formed not in Washington, D.C., not in the halls of Congress or some meeting room, but it was formed on a private island off the coast of Georgia called Jekyll Island. This island in those days was a club they called the Jekyll Island Club, and its members were a relatively small group of billionaires from New York, people like J.P. Morgan and William Rockefeller and their business associates. When they went to the island, they all traveled aboard the private railroad car of Senator Nelson Aldrich. This was November of 1910, and he and 6 other men were told they mustn't be seen together, they couldn't dine together on that evening, and they must avoid newspaper reporters at all costs. One of them carried a shotgun. Just in case he had been confronted by a reporter, he was prepared to tell them that he was going on a duck hunting trip. When they got on board this railroad car, they were told not to address each other by last names, first names only. And 2 of them even went further, and they adopted code names. They were concerned that the identities of all of these 7 men might be known to the servants on board the car, and that the servants might talk about it. And in that fashion, the word would get out. Even when they got to the island and went to the clubhouse, they had replaced all of the normal servants with new servants who didn't know any of these people. And they created the Federal Reserve under those kinds of conditions of great secrecy. I can assure you that very few wars of history have ever been plotted under conditions of greater secrecy than that.
According to accidental releases of Fed stockholder information, as of 11:05 a.m., Tuesday, July 26, 1983, 5 member banks own 53% of the stock in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the most major of the 12 Federal Reserve banks around the country. This is a controlling interest in the controlling bank. The major stockholders of this major bank, however, are confidential. No one, not even the government or the President of the United States, knows who they are, nor can they find out. We all began to lose track of this ownership on Tuesday, the 26th of July, 1983. Only a small group of elite insiders knows who these owners or controlling agents are in present time. Does this sound like a Thomas Jefferson operation? Does this so-called Federal Reserve System sound like something Ben Franklin, the man who invented the pot-bellied stove and co-authored the Constitution, would set up? Or does this system sound more like something George Orwell would write about in his nightmare book, 1984? Again, G. Edward Griffin.
In those days, there was a great deal of concern among the American people about the concentration of financial power in the hands of a few very wealthy and powerful financial interests in Wall Street. They called this the money trust. And the cry in those days was to break the grip of the money trust. And one of the primary purposes of the Federal Reserve Act, as it was promoted to the American people, was just that, to break the grip of the money trust. They were going to write a law that was going to take the power away from these people and put it in the hands of their trustworthy politicians, you see. Put it in the hands of the people through the electoral process. That was the propaganda behind the Federal Reserve System. So what's the purpose of the secrecy? It's because when you look at the list of these people who went, they were the money trust. They were the representatives of the banks, of J.P. Morgan, the Rockefellers. They represented Kuhn-Loeb and Company, Warburgs in Germany and the Netherlands, and the Rothschilds in England. This was the money trust, not only of the United States, but of the world. Had that fact been known, who these people were that were drafting the Federal Reserve System, the trick would have been exposed, and the public never would have adopted the Federal Reserve Act as, in fact, they did.
When you think about the significance of the Federal Reserve Act being passed under those conditions, the American people didn't know, but it was banking interests that were behind it. Powerful banking interests, because they wanted their assets protected. They wanted the Federal Reserve to be the lender of last resort. So if they had been loaning out and risking the money, and these loans go bad, instead of having the market take care of this, they wanted bailed out. And this is why it was a tremendous popular thing to do for the banks and, of course, the big business people who were borrowing the money. So it was very, very special interest directed, and it was designed for the elite. And even today, a lot of people don't quite understand that. So it's an educational job as well outside of Washington, but hopefully someday people here in Washington, especially the members of the Banking Committee, will gain some interest in this subject, because ultimately we will have to address it.
Where does Congress get most of its funding?
I would like to say from us, but I'm sure they have foreign investors that they also get their money from.
Okay.
Taxes.
People?
Government.
It gets it out of federal taxation, of course.
From taxes, but if you mean today, a great deal we're getting from China buying treasury bills.
They print it.
And can you elaborate on that?
They have no funding. They have no money. It's all puff and mirrors. They have no money. It's all an illusion. There's not much in back of it.
As we can see, the average American citizen has conflicting ideas as to where Congress gets its funding. In actuality, Congress gets most of it by borrowing it from the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve gets the so-called money by effectively printing it up. The whole process is known as the Mandrake mechanism. Thus, today's paper currency, far from the gold and silver coinage stipulated by the founders, is essentially created out of thin air.
Most people are alarmed when they hear about the fact that the Fed can create money out of nothing and charge interest on it, so-called interest. It starts with Congress. Remember, a moment ago I said that the Federal Reserve System was a partnership between a cartel and the federal government.
Mr. Chairman, we've got to go vote, and we want to thank you for being here with us for today. And,
well, if there's a partnership,
thank you also for,
there's a reason for the partners, both of them, to be in it, or they wouldn't be. So why is the banking fraternity in this partnership, and why are the politicians in it? Congress needs more money. They always need more money. They like to spend money. That gets them elected. They don't like to raise taxes because that gets them unelected. The answer, of course, is that they borrow it. If you're not going to tax it from somebody, you can borrow it from somebody else. And that's why we have government bonds and treasury notes and bills and so forth. And we have what's called the national debt, because they borrowed money to pay for current expenses that they don't want to pay for through taxes, because that would be unpopular. So 30 days after they borrowed $1 billion, or 60 days, whatever the term of the loan is, they have to pay that money back. Well, lo and behold, it turns out that the congressmen and the senators are still not taking in as much money in taxes as they are spending in benefits, so they don't have the money to repay the loan. So what do? Easy. Borrow some more. Borrow enough to pay back the original loan, plus a little bit more to keep them in office. So this process goes on and on and on, and that's why we have the national debt growing and growing and growing. The Federal Reserve enters the picture at this stage because, you see, they can never borrow enough from the private sector. There's never enough existing money out there for the politicians to borrow. So what do? They go to the Federal Reserve System, and by agreement, remember this is their partner now, the Federal Reserve System agrees literally to create the money that they're going to lend to the government. It's not really a lending at all, as you can see, but they use the old traditional words of lending it to the government, when in fact all they're doing is just printing it for the government. They're creating it.